The job offer was a lifeline wrapped in an enigma. Archivist needed for private collection, secluded estate, generous stipend, discretion paramount. For Elias Vance, whose academic career had just been unceremoniously dismantled by budget cuts, it was an offer he couldn't refuse, no matter how peculiar its phrasing. The estate was called Blackwood Manor, and it rose from the misty, pine-choked hills of North Georgia like a decaying tooth. It was a Gothic monstrosity of weeping grey stone, sharp gables, and windows that watched him like vacant eyes as his sputtering sedan crawled up the gravel drive. A man who introduced himself only as Mr. Finch, the caretaker, greeted him at the door. He was a creature of parchment skin and dusty tweed, smelling faintly of old paper and decay. "Your work is in the West Wing," Finch said, his voice a dry rustle. "Mr. Alistair, the curator, is waiting for you there. He does not receive guests often." The inside of the manor was a labyrinth of shadows and silence, where dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light piercing through grimy windows. The air was heavy, still and cold, carrying the weight of years. Elias followed Finch to a set of immense oak doors, behind which lay the library. It was a bibliophile's fever dream. 2 stories of towering shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes, circling a central reading area. A spiral staircase of wrought iron clung to the wall, ascending into the gloom. At a massive mahogany desk sat Mr. Alistair, a man so thin and frail he seemed in danger of being swept away by a stray draft. His eyes, however, were startlingly sharp, burning with a strange feverish intensity in his gaunt face. "Mr. Vance," Alistair rasped, not rising. "You are here for the collection." "Yes, sir." The advertisement was intriguing. "Intriguing," Alistair repeated, a faint, mirthless smile touching his lips. "A diplomatic word." He gestured to a cordoned-off alcove, smaller and darker than the rest of the library. "Most of the collection is standard fare. Incunabula, first editions, family ledgers. Your task, however, concerns our more unique acquisitions, the Anamnesis collection." The word was unfamiliar. Anamnesis? From the Greek, a remembering of things forgotten, Alistair explained, his eyes fixed on the alcove. "These are not works of fiction. They are journals, diaries, and logs. Their authors all shared a common, peculiar affliction. They recorded memories they insisted were not their own." Elias felt a prickle of unease. "You mean, like delusions?" "Perhaps, or perhaps something else." Alistair's gaze drifted to the window, to the dying light outside. "Your job is simple. Catalogue them, transcribe them. Do not try to understand them. And above all, do not take your work home with you. The memories in this house have a tendency to be tenacious." The Anamnesis collection consisted of a few hundred leather-bound journals, all unmarked save for a small stamped number. Elias chose one at random. "No, 73, and opened it. The handwriting was an elegant, looping script belonging to a woman named Lenora from the late 19th century. "October 12, 1888, it began. "Another memory came today, unbidden. I was standing in the scullery, watching the rain, and for a moment, I was not myself. My hands were not my own. They were a man's hands, coarse and calloused, clutching a length of rope. I could feel the rough hemp against my palms, smell the salt and the sea, and taste a profound, bottomless despair. It was not my despair. I have never seen the sea." Elias worked for hours, his fascination overriding his initial skepticism. The journals were filled with similar accounts. A farmer who remembered the terror of a cavalry charge from a battle fought a century before his birth. A young socialite who could vividly recall the precise, agonizing pain of being burned at the stake. They were disjointed, nonsensical, yet written with a chilling conviction. It was Lenora's journal, however, that held him captive. Her borrowed memories were darker, more personal, and seemed to revolve around Blackwood Manor itself. "November 3rd, 1888. The memory that haunts me most is of the cellar. I feel a cold that has nothing to do with the winter air. It is a damp, earthen cold. There is a hunger in the darkness, a waiting presence. My own hand, which is not my own, is digging, clawing at the packed dirt beneath the flagstones. It is desperate to find something, or perhaps to bury it. Days bled into weeks. Elias developed a routine. He would drive to the manor, exchange terse greetings with Finch, receive a silent, assessing nod from Alistair, and then lose himself in the alcove. He transcribed the journals onto his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys, the strange, impossible memories of long-dead people flowing through him. Then, the glitches began. It started small. He would be walking to the kitchen for coffee and find himself in the conservatory, with no memory of changing direction. Once, he looked down and saw he was holding a small, tarnished silver locket he didn't recognize, its hinge cold against his palm. He dropped it with a clatter, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found it later in a display case, a relic of the Blackwood family. He had no recollection of opening the case. The whispers started next, faint, sibilant sounds at the edge of his hearing, like the rustle of dry leaves or the turning of a page in an empty room. He would look up from his work, his senses on high alert, but the library would be utterly still, Alistair a silent statue at his desk. One night, he was jerked from a deep sleep, his body drenched in sweat. The scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood, filled his nostrils. He flicked on his bedside lamp and saw that his fingernails were caked with dark, rich soil. He stared at them, his breath catching in his throat, Lenora's words echoing in his mind. My own hand, which is not my own, is digging. He became obsessed. During the day, he feverishly transcribed Lenora's journal, her anxieties becoming his own. At night, he researched the history of the manor, digging through online archives and county records. He learned of the Blackwood melancholy, a so-called hereditary madness that had claimed several members of the family, driving them to suicide or seclusion. The symptoms, described in a 19th century medical text, were a terrifying match for the experiences in the anamnesis journals. Memory loss, fugue states, and a pervasive sense of being an unwelcome guest in one's own mind. He confronted Alistair, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and accusation. What is this place? What are these books? Alistair looked at him, his gaze filled with a profound, ancient weariness. I told you not to try to understand, he whispered. This house, it remembers. The books are merely its vocabulary. We who come here are the paper on which it writes its stories. That's insane, Elias choked out. Is it? Alistair's lips curled into that same horrifyingly empty smile. Tell me, Mr. Vance, when you dream, whose dreams are you dreaming? That night, the dream came. It was more vivid, more real than anything he had ever experienced. He was Lenora. He felt the scratch of her woolen dress against his skin, the tightness of the corset around his ribs. He walked the halls of Blackwood Manor, not as a visitor, but as a prisoner. He descended a set of stone steps he'd never seen, his path lit by a single guttering candle. He was heading for the cellar. He knew what he would find: the packed earth floor, the oppressive cold, the waiting hunger in the dark. He felt her hands begin to tremble, not with fear, but with a terrible, magnetic purpose. He had to get to it. He had to uncover what was buried. Elias awoke with a gasp, but he wasn't in his bed. He was standing in the main hall of Blackwood Manor, the moonlight painting ghostly patterns on the marble floor. The front door was ajar. He had driven there in his sleep. A force, a memory that was not his, pulled him forward. He didn't need a candle. He knew the way. Past the silent library, through a servant's corridor, and down a flight of narrow stone stairs hidden behind a tapestry. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of wet soil and rot. He was in the cellar. It was just as Lenora had described: a low, vaulted ceiling, earthen floors, and a darkness so absolute it felt solid. The pull led him to the center of the room, to a section of the floor that was oddly bare, the flagstones disturbed. His hands, acting on their own volition, began to claw at the dirt. The soil was loose, recently turned. Beneath it, His fingers brushed against the cold, smooth leather of a book. It was older than the others, the cover warped and stained, bound with rusted iron clasps. It was chained to a stake driven deep into the earth. This was the source, the first journal, the heart of the house's memory. As his fingers closed around it, the waiting presence in the room lunged. It wasn't a physical attack, but a psychic deluge. A torrent of memories, not his memories, crashed into his mind. He was a soldier dying in a muddy trench, a child lost in a burning forest, a heretic screaming in the flames. He was every author of every journal, their fears, their pain, their identities all pouring into him, dissolving his own sense of self like sugar in water. He was Lenora, he was the farmer, he was the socialite, he was Alistair, he was generations of Blackwoods, their melancholy a living thing inside him. The fragile dam of his identity broke. Elias Vance ceased to be. Sunlight, weak and grey, streamed through the high windows of the library. A figure sat at the curator's desk, thin and still, staring at the empty chair in the archivist's alcove. After a long moment, the figure, whose face was a pale and hollow mask, reached for a fresh, empty journal and a fountain pen. The hand, which was not quite its own, uncapped the pen. The nib scratched across the first page, the script a strange, spidery hybrid of a dozen different styles. "My name is Elias Vance," it wrote, "and I am remembering a story that is not my own." The house was quiet. The collection was complete, and in the silence, it waited for the next reader.